Welcome to my channel, where your adventure into the future starts right now. Step into a vibrant universe filled with groundbreaking technology, breathtaking alien landscapes, and exhilarating sci-fi narratives that challenge your imagination. From daring explorations of distant galaxies to haunting journeys through dystopian societies, we uncover the most captivating stories and innovative ideas that will shape the world of tomorrow. Subscribe today and join us on an incredible intergalactic voyage that promises to inspire and thrill. For centuries, prisons across the galaxy had been synonymous with punishment. As humanity spread out into the stars, colonizing distant planets and forging new civilizations, the concept of punishment for criminal behavior followed suit, expanding from Earth-based systems to the far reaches of space. These intergalactic prisons were monumental structures, vast, often isolated facilities located on barren moons or within the cold void of uninhabited star systems. They housed millions of individuals who had broken the law, committed acts of violence, or defied the social order in some way. The idea of correction, or rehabilitation, was a distant afterthought. Instead, these prisons were built with the sole purpose of keeping dangerous individuals away from the rest of society. There were places where time seemed to stretch on indefinitely, and the lives of the incarcerated were measured in years of isolation and suffering. But as humanity's understanding of society, justice, and rehabilitation evolved, so too did their approach to criminal justice. What was once seen as the only viable solution, warehousing criminals in remote, impersonal prisons, was increasingly being questioned. After centuries of reliance on punitive measures, a growing movement began to take root, one focused on reforming not just individuals, but the very systems that created them. The philosophy was simple: what if incarceration didn't have to be about punishment? What if, instead, it could be about healing, reintegration, and making amends for past wrongs? The movement to turn intergalactic prisons into rehabilitation centers was born not out of naive idealism, but from hard-earned lessons learned over the course of generations. Across the galaxy, humanity was confronted with an uncomfortable truth: the prison system, in its many forms, was not working. Recidivism rates were shockingly high. Prisons, once seen as a necessary evil, were overflowing. The criminal justice system was based on antiquated models, largely unchanged since the early days of colonization. These facilities were designed not to reintegrate people back into society, but to break them down, to strip them of their identity, their dignity, and, for many, their hope for a future. The idea of rehabilitation was, at best, a secondary consideration. The vast majority of prisoners were from lower socioeconomic classes, marginalized communities, or those who had committed crimes in moments of desperation. It became clear that the justice system disproportionately affected those who were most vulnerable. There were no rehabilitation programs to address the root causes of their crimes: poverty, trauma, lack of education, addiction, and mental illness. Instead, they were locked away, sometimes for life, in facilities designed to erase them from the public consciousness. The decision to transform these intergalactic prisons into rehabilitation centers was sparked by a significant turning point in humanity's history. As the colonization of new planets reached its peak, a number of interstellar governments and private entities began to question the efficiency, morality, and long-term impact of the prison industrial complex. A series of high-profile, public scandals related to abuse, neglect, and overcrowding in these prison systems led to widespread public outcry. Calls for reform reached a fever pitch, culminating in the formation of a multi-species coalition of human rights activists, progressive thinkers, legal scholars, and former convicts who advocated for a new approach to justice in the galaxy. At first, the idea of transforming prisons into rehabilitation centers was met with resistance. Many viewed the concept of rehabilitation as weak or naive, especially when dealing with violent offenders or those convicted of serious crimes. Criminals were, for the most part, seen as unworthy of second chances. The prevailing sentiment in many sectors was that prisons were meant to punish, to instill fear, and to protect society from dangerous individuals. For years, the notion that prisons could be places of healing seemed fanciful, impractical, or even dangerous. The vast majority of intergalactic prison facilities were located on remote moons or in the depths of uninhabited star systems, far from the prying eyes of public oversight. These were places where accountability was minimal, and the power of the prison system went largely unchecked. Yet the pressure for change continued to mount as public sentiment shifted and a new generation of policymakers and thinkers emerged. They argued that the true measure of a society's progress was not how harshly it punished its criminals, but how effectively it rehabilitated those who had lost their way. The transformation began as a pilot program, with one prison being selected for conversion into a rehabilitation center. The idea was to test the model in one location before expanding it to others across the galaxy. This pilot program would focus on a mix of low-level offenders, nonviolent criminals, and individuals who had committed crimes due to circumstances beyond their control, those caught up in cycles of poverty, addiction, or trauma. The first step in the conversion of intergalactic prisons into rehabilitation centers was to reimagine what a prison was and what it should stand for. The notion of incarceration itself was stripped of its punitive nature. Prisons were no longer to be seen as places of punishment, but as centers for education, growth, and therapy. The focus shifted from simply containing individuals to providing the tools necessary for them to rebuild their lives, heal from past trauma, and make amends with society. The physical infrastructure of the prisons was radically reimagined as well. Gone were the cold, imposing, fortress-like structures that had once been synonymous with oppression. In their place, the prison environments were designed to foster collaboration, communication, and healing. The architecture became open and welcoming, with green spaces, communal areas, and therapeutic facilities incorporated into the design. One of the first changes was the implementation of comprehensive educational programs. Prisoners were given access to high-quality education, ranging from basic literacy programs to advanced university-level courses in various fields. The focus was not just on vocational training or job readiness, but on empowering individuals to think critically, to understand their past actions, and to envision a future beyond incarceration. These educational initiatives were supported by advanced technologies, such as neural interfaces, which allowed prisoners to access information and learn in ways that were previously impossible. Mental health and addiction services were also a core part of the rehabilitation model. It became clear that many of those incarcerated had underlying psychological issues that had contributed to their criminal behavior. Many suffered from untreated trauma, depression, anxiety, and a range of other mental health conditions. Drug addiction was another factor that led to criminality in many cases, particularly in the underprivileged sectors of society. Rehabilitation centers were equipped with cutting-edge therapy techniques, including virtual reality therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and somatic healing practices. These therapies helped prisoners to address the root causes of their actions and to learn coping mechanisms for managing emotions, behaviors, and impulses. Another groundbreaking aspect of the rehabilitation program was the emphasis on restorative justice. Rather than focusing solely on punishing the individual, the system sought to repair the harm done to victims and the community at large. Offenders were required to engage in dialogue with their victims, to listen to their pain, and to make reparations whenever possible. This process was difficult and emotional, but it was also deeply transformative. It encouraged prisoners to take responsibility for their actions in ways that a traditional punishment-based system never had. Restorative justice also emphasized community engagement, with inmates often participating in projects that benefited the local population, such as rebuilding infrastructure, providing services to marginalized communities, and helping with environmental cleanup efforts. A critical element of this rehabilitation model was the involvement of families and communities. It became clear that successful rehabilitation could not take place in isolation. It required the active participation of those around the incarcerated individual. Family members were included in therapy sessions and educational programs, helping to rebuild the social bonds that had been fractured by crime. Local communities were also invited to be part of the process, helping to reintegrate ex-prisoners into society by providing job opportunities, social support networks, and mentorship. The transformation of intergalactic prisons into rehabilitation centers was not without its challenges. There were inevitable tensions between traditionalists who believed in the effectiveness of punitive measures and reformists who advocated for rehabilitation. Many feared that this new approach would lead to an increase in crime or that it would be viewed as being too lenient on offenders. However, as the first rehabilitation centers began to yield results showing a significant reduction in recidivism rates and an increase in successful reintegration into society, the naysayers grew quieter. The results spoke for themselves. Prisoners who had once been locked away for life were now returning to society as productive, rehabilitated citizens. Many had gone on to become leaders in their communities, advocates for reform, or mentors to those who were still incarcerated. The transformation of these intergalactic prisons was no longer just a theoretical ideal, it had become a living, breathing reality. Over the years, the model of rehabilitation spread to more and more facilities across the galaxy. What had once been seen as a radical experiment became the new norm. Prisoners, once viewed as lost causes, were now seen as individuals capable of growth and change. The galaxy began to see a sharp decline in prison populations as the focus shifted from punishment to healing. There were, of course, still individuals who posed a genuine threat to society and who required isolation for public safety reasons. However, even these individuals were offered the opportunity for rehabilitation, with the understanding that, one day, they too might be reintegrated into society. The success of this program sent a powerful message across the galaxy. The story of how humanity had transformed its prison system from an instrument of fear and isolation to one of healing and reconciliation became a beacon of hope for other species. It showed that, despite the darkness of the past, it was possible to create systems that emphasized compassion, accountability, and the potential for change. The transformation of intergalactic prisons into rehabilitation centers marked the beginning of a new era in justice, one where individuals were no longer defined by their worst actions, but by their capacity for growth, redemption, and reintegration into society.